Should livestock farming continue? Yes or no? This is a hot topic globally, and one that a lot of activists, scientists, and people all across the world are trying to answer. And that debate might not be settled in my lifetime still, but I know there's a lot of scientists out there asking the exact same questions and answering it. So in this episode, I interviewed a grazing specialist who's worked on the restoration of mining lands using livestock and has seen firsthand what happens when we have livestock, when we don't have livestock, and he's given us a little bit of insights just into how the natural ecology of grass and animals work and why livestock might be essential or not in this system. View this episode to find out, and if you'd like to see more, let me know what. I'm here with Wayne Truter. He is a grazing specialist, and I'll leave the introduction over to you to just briefly explain where you're currently working, what your field of expertise is, so that we can from there go into a nice discussion on livestock and grazing.
Right, thank you, Enrique. I'm currently the chairman of the executive board and scientific committee for the FPLRI Institute. It's an institute that focuses on research, technology, and development aspects of integrated livestock, pasture management, soils, and things like that, and also a research professor at the University of the Free State in the Natural and Agricultural Sciences faculty.
Okay, and obviously you have years of experience in pasture, in grazing, and especially the livestock integration part. And now a topic that is sort of a global topic, but more a question is, what is the role of livestock? Do we need livestock? Are they essential? Can they just be removed? There's a lot of topics about, free range, pasture based, all of those things, and just simply whether we can do without livestock or not. And I feel you are almost best equipped to answer that question, is what is the role of livestock, and what is it that you sort of wish people knew about how essential livestock is?
Yeah, Enrique, I think this is quite a complex topic of discussion, and I think we've had many opportunities to discuss it. But I think what really is important to me is we always talk about the soil, the plant, which is the pasture, and then the livestock continuum, and that is a closed system. Very often we look at these different factors individually. We always look at soil health, we look at pasture productivity, we look at animal health and productivity and performance. But when we start getting questions around the sustainability of these systems, we never look at them in an integrated way. And I think what's really important for me, for people to understand, is that each of these factors play a huge role in a closed system with, towards each other. When I look at pasture, sustainable pasture management, we cannot do it without the animal factor.
And do you refer specifically to planted pastures or natural grazing as well?
Both. A good example I can use, which is an artificial system, which basically touches on both natural and pasture, is when we look at rehabilitating degraded land.
Okay.
Now, when you are trying to, and rehabilitation is a broad term because it refers to restoration, reclamation, regeneration. There's so many different aspects. But when we try and fix these degraded systems, it's always about we improve the soil so that we can grow plants. And 9 out of the 10 times the plants we grow are pasture based, or they are grasses or legumes or herbaceous material. But then we rely on these two to interact, but the sustainability of the system is incomplete because there's not the animal factor.
I see.
So we see this like mine rehabilitation projects. I can use many different examples where we have rehabilitated surface mines all over the country, all over the world for that matter, and these systems have been functioning for years without the animals, and they are not sustainable.
What do you measure sustainability by in that aspect?
So persistence
Okay.
of the vegetation, not just persistence, but also how the soil regenerates itself. Now, vegetation has got a function. Over and above that, it's the interface between soil and the consumer. Whether the consumer, when I say consumer, is the animal or even a human being. But that vegetation has to be managed. It has to be utilized because it has no function in the soil if it's not utilized. Because if you look at that, like I say, the interface, it joins these two systems through a root system. And that root system is dependent on how the above ground biomass is utilized, whatever the way it is utilized. And that is why in a lot of these systems, if you don't have something that is, or an organism that is consuming the vegetation in a sustainable manner, you're not going to have an improvement in the soil. And that is the continuum which we need to try and maintain to be able to achieve a sustainable and a closed system.
So what have you seen just in that specific examples, the areas that have not utilized livestock in the soil rehabilitation versus the systems that have integrated livestock into the system?
Yeah. So obviously when we try and regenerate soil, we start off with a soil that is, it might not necessarily be of the best fertility. Very often a lot of soils that are planted to pastures or grasses, for example, are marginal soils, even in the agricultural industry. But if you look at in the rehabilitation industry, these soils are very nutrient depleted, and they are to some extent marginal. Anyway, we introduce vegetation that can adapt to these quite extreme environments. We try and improve fertility, and then the vegetation grows. So we always start in these sort of degraded environments. We start off with an agronomic approach, a planted pasture approach, where we actually introduce pastures to these soils to catalyze the system, with the hope that as the system improves, it then stabilizes and then starts moving to more natural system. So it naturalizes, and then with the idea that it will eventually become a lot more biodiverse, a lot more resilient, like we typically find in a natural grazing system. But this never happens. So when I go and look at pastures that have been established, that have been managed, maybe from a mechanical way, by harvesting the material and fertilizing the system, and then hoping that the vegetation then becomes more diverse, it never happens.
Sure.
Biodiversity and fertility don't go in the same sentence.
I see.
So if you want a biodiverse environment, fertility is not your driver.
Can you just briefly explain why?
So when you look at biodiversity and you look at different species, some species have a higher nutrient requirement than others. Okay. When I improve fertility in the soil, certain species will benefit, others that don't have a high nutrient requirement are suppressed by the dominant species that have a higher fertility. So you never get that balance, that the vegetation actually gets that resilience factor, because it's always how do we weigh up fertility versus how do we do that in a system? How do we get that in the system? So initially, to try and get vegetation into a degraded soil, yes, we have to catalyze it by adding fertility, but it should be a system that starts to establish its own sustainable fertility process that is replenishes itself, not something that we have to replenish.
Yes.
But it cannot be done without the animal factor, because we've seen time and again where you do introduce livestock, I can be less dependent on fertility inputs from a sort of a conventional way of adding fertilizers. Yes. But when I bring animals into it, especially ruminants, livestock, which have the ability to convert grasses into, take out what they need for their own growth, but at the same time convert that plant material into nutrient format that gets back to the soil with the microbes, with the manure and all that. That just, again, stimulates the system. And that is what we try and create with animals. I look at a lot of rehabilitation projects where they want to bring in fertilizers, and then they want to bring microbial inoculants to try and improve soils. And then I say to myself, why do you want to do that? If you look at the microbial community in the gut of a ruminant, my goodness, you cannot even add a microbial inoculant with that diversity than what you're getting from the animals. So they already, there's an advantage of just having that introduced. Yes, it's a slower process. You know, it looks like if I fertilize vegetables with inorganic fertilizers versus organic manures, this one's much faster, much more reactive. It shows you so much, sort of improvement.
But probably on the short term.
Short term. It's a dependent system. But with organic materials, it's a completely different situation. It's slower release, it's stable. It takes place within the different variables that are, so climatic variables, the soil variables. So the microbes drive that system.
Okay, so the actual ruminal microbes that they excrete, so that their manure is sort of the driving factor in that.
For sure, it's a balanced nutrient and also microbial load.
Yes.
And that microbial load, some of it will proliferate if the soil has already got a nutrient and an improved nutrient or fertility. Carbon being a very important driving factor of these systems because it's energy for the microbes. But nevertheless, the animal factor is crucial. You cannot. The other thing that's important is when you're looking at pastures, there's no better organism than livestock to harvest grazing material.
And specific, what type of livestock? Are you referring to all grazers, sheep and
they all got a different impact on grazing. They all graze differently. They all have different grazing behaviors. Some more selective than others. You just look in the wildlife, sort of community. You've got different types of grazers, and they all have a contribution to make. Being bulk removal versus selective removal, and these things obviously we try and manage when we apply grazing systems, but no, it's all animals that graze that have an impact on how that plant's going to respond. And grasses were made for livestock. There's a reason why they're ruminants.
Yes.
And they just have the ability, and the way they, like I say, you can come in with a mower and you can cut grass all off at the same level. It's having an advantage on some plants and it's having a disadvantage on other plants.
Okay.
Where grazers, if they're grazing together, they have there is an interaction between these organisms that you just got to look at how animals graze. Why do they graze differently in the morning than they graze in the afternoon? Why do they graze certain plants in the morning, but they graze different plants in the afternoon? So there's dynamics there that
you can't replicate.
We cannot replicate. We can manage them to some extent by applying, to obviously try and get the most out of a system, and that's where we start focusing on productivity. But when you focus too much on productivity, you can harbor on becoming an unsustainable system. So it's a fine balance.
So there is, from what I understand, there is sustainable grazing practices and there's unsustainable grazing practices. Sure. It's not like where there's livestock, it's always just beautiful and they have a wonderful effect on the ecology of the system. It can be overutilized or underutilized. And maybe just explain that in itself is what does underutilization look like and the effects thereof, and what does overutilization look like and the effects thereof, because obviously the farmers need to manage it.
No, look, grazing management is a complex process. It's not an easy one, and time again, the history of grazing is very important. Some people might have not managed previously in the right manner, and they then leave land to someone else that has been overgrazed. And overgrazed or overutilized, if you look at it from a natural pasture perspective, you'll find that biodiversity has been impacted on. You'll find that all the palatable species have been removed. So you sit with a whole bunch of pioneer species which naturally their role is to try and improve the system that has already been depleted. So these plants, you'll just look from a forage quality perspective, just visually looking at the plants don't have a lot of leaf material, but have slightly higher seed production. Okay. It's like looking at a wheat species. A wheat species grows in areas where you don't want it in the first place because nothing else wants to grow there. But they produce a lot of seed, and they try and re-establish. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but what they're trying to do is they're trying to protect the soil surface and the environment in which they're growing. So pioneer species do that. But when you sit with an underutilized system, it can also have a negative impact. It's easier to I always say it's always easier to manage an underutilized system and getting it back to a nice, acceptable, pristine, or not necessarily pristine, but grazing system, valuable grazing system, than trying to take an overutilized system. There's a huge time difference between that. But looking at an underutilized system is that you find dominant species. And these dominant species are so overpowering that they can actually inhibit other species that are of value to also perform, or to grow. So when you've got an underutilized system, it's sometimes going to be required that you actually put a lot of pressure on it. Put a lot of pressure on these dominant species to be able to open up the canopy for those species that have higher forage value to come through, to give them the competitive edge, because these dominant ones, they just overshadow the soils. They established well, they got sort of competitive root systems and so forth. There's a whole bunch of variables that will contribute to that, but you have to manage that system also in a different way. Like I say, you've got to try and get that system into an equilibrium.
Yeah. Well, the sort of the golden thread that I'm hearing is management, which tells me that we cannot just leave nature to be nature. And I mean, it feels sort of logical because industrialization occurred, urbanization occurred, none of the natural ecological environments are the way that they were thousands of years ago. Humans intervened. But what I'm hearing is that we need to continue to intervene. Is that, firstly, am I right in saying that? Secondly, is it applicable everywhere, or are there still areas which requires less intervention than others?
I think to answer your question is, as soon as you erect a fence, you create a boundary.
Okay.
And we've put up boundaries all over.
Yeah.
We don't have vast open areas anymore.
And I mean, that's globally, not just in South Africa.
All over. So, a fence, a development, around any development there's a fence or a wall or whatever. And that has definitely restricted movement of animals and so forth. So as long as there's a fence, you're going to always have to manage. And that is just my view on that. So, and in the past, there's been fences, and the areas that are between those fences have been poorly managed. And they are going to require a certain level of intervention, a management intervention. And some are going to require more than others, so it always depends on what's your baseline. And I always say to somebody when they buy a farm or when they want to start grazing practices or whatever, is you got to know what you're starting off with before you can make a recommendation on what you need to do. To now just go and apply a system that works for you, or that you think will work for you, might shoot you in the foot at the end of the day, because there's so many different systems out there, and each of them have advantages and disadvantages. But those advantages and disadvantages are only visible once you know what you're starting off with.
Yeah, and you refer now to knowing whether it's underutilized, overutilized, monocultures, knowing what the biodiversity is of the system.
What is the potential? What is it? What is that current grazing capacity at that point? What is that productivity of that point? I know, taking planted pastures as an example, I know farmers that have planted pastures that have been growing for 30 years, they tell me. And I say, wow, that's fantastic, what is the productivity? And when they start telling me what their numbers are that they're getting off this, then productively they might not, or economically they might not be what they should be, and there is maybe a requirement that they have to be replaced. Unless you accept that you're happy with that kind of productivity.
Yeah, I mean, that increases your land usage and everything.
Yeah. So, you look at a farmer that's been grazing a piece of land for 30 years and making hay on the same land on a planted pasture. And if he really had records for the 30 years, he would have seen a gradual decline in productivity and performance.
Yeah.
Whereas if there's another farmer that monitors that, so it depends on where your baseline is, what you start off with. He monitors it and he realizes at around about 10 years that if he replaces that pasture, that he's going to maintain that productivity for the next 10 years. And then, but everybody's afraid of the cost of replacement, but the cost of replacement might be cheaper than the long-term loss over the 30 years. There's just one example. So again, it's where you start off with.
I see.
And whether that whatever the system is can handle what you require from it in terms of your animal numbers or whatever. So yeah, it's all about measuring to know.
I see. Yeah, and again, that comes back to management. Is we can't just leave a piece of felt that we think is natural, which has long been disturbed, and just leave it to sort of do its natural thing. It does require intervention. And on that, where do you think we stand globally? Because globally there is a narrative to just add livestock everywhere. On the one hand, because of the positive attributions that they can add to the soil, the positive impact on productivity and carbon sequestration and all of those things. And on the other hand, there's a narrative to just simply remove livestock because they're damaging and they utilize so much land and all these methane emissions. What's your stance on that? And
yeah, it's a complex topic, and one needs many hours to discuss it. But I think the short answer to that is that firstly, as I've explained, pasture and soil regeneration cannot be done without animals. The narrative of putting more animals on, I say, is valid if the system can tolerate it, can carry it.
Okay.
Because if you do want your pasture component to regenerate the soil, it has to be harvested, because I always say the rule of thumb that I use is that whatever you see above ground in terms of biomass, there's 2 to 3 times, depending on species, and there's 2 to 3 times the same amount of biomass, living biomass, below ground. The only time the living biomass below ground can contribute to the carbon of the soil to regenerate it, to make it a more sustainable soil environment, is when the roots die. Living root can't contribute to carbon. So the only time the root will contribute to carbon is when the root dies. The only time the root dies is when the plant has to draw on the reserves in the roots to be able to grow new leaf material, to be able to activate the photosynthetic process so that it can then build roots again or store reserves. But that root dieback that takes place is only happens when you harvest the plant. Now, with all the natural hectares of land out there or grazing, we can't drive around with mowers harvesting plant. We can't always just rely on fires to remove that. So animals become an important factor.
I see.
And I think what's important is if you look at globally, there's many different types of grasslands. They all have different productive capacities and potentials. And if you can just make sure that the animals are in line with what the vegetation is producing, you just look at grazing capacity on a grassland versus on a savanna. Hugely different, and it's got a lot to do with soil fertility, climate, and the biomass production. So biomass is a determinant factor of how many animals you can have there. So I think that's important. The vegetation will tell you how many animals I can have.
But there has to be an animal. That's sort of
there has to be an animal,
line.
because how else are you going to stimulate that plant to be able to regenerate the soil?
I see.
And the plant is there to sequester. And the sequestration that takes place is building a root system. But the only time it makes the contribution is when you have to remove that vegetation. Everything needs to still be maintained. And plants aren't just there to just grow and to stagnate. They also have a reproductive cycle. They also have an expiry date. And they also have to replace themselves. They also have to produce new offspring. It's their system. They have a reproductive cycle. But what contributes to that cycle is the animal. And that's the interaction you have. And if you don't have anything consuming or utilizing the grassland or pasture component, it's going to become a degraded system. You're going to find that you're going to sit like where you find in a country where you've just got old people and no young people.
Good analogy.
And pastures is the same thing. You don't just want to have old plants. And I can take you back to those examples. I said a 30-year-old pasture has just got old plants in it. And if you really go and look in between those there's no new plants. So the productivity is it's just heading towards degradation. Because if you look at that, coming back to the pastures, there's 30-year-old plants lying there, no young plants in between. The communities the plants are becoming a lot more sparsely arranged, that there's getting soil erosion, and the whole system is starting to collapse. So you need rejuvenation, and that's where the animal grazing factor becomes crucial.
And obviously in some areas I understand if people would prefer wildlife to do that, to serve that function, but realistically the areas that are grazable aren't necessarily suitable for wildlife. There isn't natural predation, so if you introduce wildlife that is not managed, the system would collapse anyways, if I understand it correctly. So that's where livestock comes in, is livestock can be managed while also supplying nutrients and other valuable byproducts. But the terms and conditions apply, if I understand it correctly, that there are still systems that you do have to monitor and maybe remove livestock initially, let the ecosystem rejuvenate, and then reintroduce livestock depending on the initial state of the pasture. Do I have that correctly?
Look, wildlife management is a wild card. It's not an easy system to manage. And I think rightfully said is why livestock is so important is because we can manage them. And because we sit with very distinct classes of what kind of grazers they are. We have cattle which are like bulk grazers. We have sheep which are selective grazers. We have goats which are browsers. And they all represent a different grazing class. When you get to wildlife, you have all these same classes, but now you have to manage the animal numbers. Because if I don't have a sufficient amount of bulk grazers, if I don't have the right proportion of selective grazers and browsers, it becomes very difficult with a wildlife system to manage it. And that's what the livestock or the domestic animals component makes it so much easier. So rightfully said, I've seen many natural systems or farms, wildlife, game farms, if we can call it that, where the grazing capacity has deteriorated because of the incorrect amount and proportions of bulk to selective grazers.
I see.
And a typical wildlife example, which we see get mentioned time and again, is the whole wildebeest zebra interaction and how they graze together, because they graze differently. They condition the pasture or the grazing component for each other. And if you cannot maintain that, it becomes a challenge. So in a natural grazing system with livestock, it's crucial. I think you can get away a lot with using cattle, but I think at some point in time it becomes an important element to introduce some selective grazers. But you can get away with just the cattle for a very long time. But yeah, it depends on what you're starting with.
Of course. Yeah, and do you have any comments about livestock's integration into cropland systems? Because there is also the argument that all of the area used for grazing and such can rather be used for cropland for human production. But from what I've seen as well, the areas that integrate crop production with livestock is also more productive.
Yeah. So if you look at currently, if you look at regenerative agriculture and that kind of approach and methodology, it's again a system that is, I don't want to say it's used to its maximum in the growing season, and then there's a dormant season or sometimes a follow-up winter season, and these soils, depending on how marginal they are or how highly arable they are, have a soil resilience factor as well. And very often, if you look at this sort of whole regenerative agriculture approach where there's no-till, where you want to not cultivate soils because it breaks down soil structure and that reduces the efficiency of fertilizers and water and all those different important aspects. But to be able to regenerate that system, again, we bring in cover crops.
Okay.
And if we look at cover crops on the whole list of all the different cover crop species, there's a large component of them are grasses and legumes and some root crops. But these are all crops that can be consumed by animals. So from the research that we've seen and what we've done is that when a crop system finishes, and the follow-up season is maybe a dormant season, there's no other follow-up crop, you can introduce cover crops, and that cover crop, again, is the function of that species is to now create an interface between the soil and that specific season, that climatic environment. Those crops grow, those roots have a function. You can either let it go through that season, and then before the next growing season, you can then introduce, remove that cover crop or reintroduce it into the soil. It just improves the soil. But what we've seen is if we bring the animal factor in there and we can consume those cover crops, what are we doing? We are now also providing another, for that season, we're extending the grazing season by providing high value crops, stimulating those root systems again, and then obviously once these plants are harvested, the roots die and then they contribute again to soil. So integrating livestock into those cropping systems with a cover crop approach can be very valuable. Being that said, it's really important that with these cover crop designs and cover crop mixtures, there are risks for livestock in terms of anti-quality factors. And then it becomes another management issue because, these livestock, you find that in these cover crops, let's put it this way, these cover crops growing in that season, it might not necessarily be the best environmental conditions for that crop to grow. And you might find certain species within that biodiverse mixture they use as a cover crop are more sensitive to the environmental fluctuation, climatic fluctuations, and those plants can stress. And when those plants stress, they can pose a risk to animal health in some cases. But again, it depends on what you're using. It depends on management. It's all about management and understanding that system. But livestock in those cropping systems are crucial. Again, they're introducing manure. They're converting the plant material while they are harvesting the plant material. They're regenerating the soil with a carbon contribution. But at the same time, they're converting the plant material, taking what they need, and returning some more carbon, more organic material, more microbial, or microbes, plus more nutrients, slow release, but it's contributing.
I see. Wow. So I think sort of as a conclusion, what would you say to a consumer currently on the fence of whether we need livestock or not?
So we do need livestock. There's no doubt. They're important component of an ecosystem. They are probably the most appropriate animals or organisms to be able to ensure that an ecosystem is functional. You can't just achieve that through soils and plants. What's the purpose of animals? Animals have always been there, not just for us to look through a binoculars they've been there to be able to keep that system going. And at the end of the day, the livestock which we use to manage these systems are important contributions to human diet. So we part of that system.
Part of the natural cycle.
It's part of the natural cycle, and we use animals to control vegetation numbers. So in some way, animal numbers also have to be controlled, and that's obviously where it becomes part of the human diet. And it's a closed system.
So we are the predators, essentially.
We're the predators, if you're going to take it in that sense. But the livestock are the predators of the vegetation, if you want to put it in predator terms. But everything controls the next step within the ecosystem, and we can't remove them, because as much as we can just eat plants, there's no doubt, but the plants that are regenerating soil we can't eat. We cannot eat grass. We can eat certain grasses, but we cannot eat enough grass to maintain that ecosystem. So what else do we have to do that? And that's the importance of the livestock component.
Well, thank you, Wayne. This was incredibly insightful, and I want to say inspirational as well, to put it in the big picture of the big ecosystem that we are currently living in, and that we as humans need to be responsible, we need to be stewards, and we need to continually manage that. So thank you very much for this discussion.
Pleasure. Great.
Thank you so much for listening. If you agree to this, like, follow, share. And if you agree to disagree, drop it in the comments and we'll take it from there. You can also go to the website agreetodisagree.com to see how you can get involved, sponsor, get a tour of your factory or farm that you want people to see, or simply ask a few questions that you'd like answers to.